Welcome to the SAFeTY Chronicles, exploring how to keep people and pets safe from the cycle of interpersonal violence. I am your host, Allie Phillips, founder and CEO of Sheltering Animals and Families Together, the SAFeTY Program, a nonprofit organization working with domestic violence shelters to eliminate the pet housing barrier to safety. As the founder, I have led the global movement in helping domestic violence shelters create on-site pet housing while elevating the criminal justice response to how animal abuse links to crimes against people. I am a former prosecuting attorney, internationally recognized legal expert and public speaker, award-winning author, and advocate for protecting vulnerable victims. In this podcast, we will explore how and why animals are harmed in the cycle of family violence and the human-animal bond that keeps victims in harm's way with their pets. Guest speakers and I will share strategies for shelters and professionals working to safeguard survivors, why pet-inclusive sheltering is life-saving, and safety tips for those who need help. None of the content will be graphic. If you are in harm's way, please contact your nearest domestic violence shelter or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of the SAFeTY Chronicles. So today I want to talk about whether your community is pet inclusive when it comes to your domestic violence services. So I get a lot of emails from caring people who love animals and they want to help their community become a safety community with a pet inclusive domestic violence shelter. I get emails from people who actually want to create a domestic violence shelter from scratch that can house pets on site. I literally got an email this morning from, a lovely lady in Mississippi who wants to set up a domestic violence shelter so that people can bring their pets with them. So I want to talk about that because it is not necessarily the easiest thing to set up a domestic violence shelter, okay? Because there's a lot of rules and regulations, because you are dealing with a vulnerable population that will need services and they need to be safe. So it's not like you can just say, hey, I'm going to buy this house and there are 8 bedrooms in it, and I'm just going to put up a sign that says we are a domestic violence shelter, and oh, by the way, you can bring your pets. That's not how it works, okay? So let me kind of dig into this and unpack this a little bit. So according to the National Network to End Domestic Violence, a wonderful, wonderful national organization, there are about 1,955 domestic violence shelters here in the United States. Each September, NNEDV, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, conducts a 24-hour survey of the needs of domestic violence victims, and they have these shelters report their numbers. So in 2022, which is the most recent survey, so September of 2022, NNEDV found that 79,334 victims of domestic violence were served by these shelters, and 70% of them received emergency sheltering. 12,692 had unmet requests for services, and 53% of those were for emergency sheltering. How many of those requests that were unmet involved people who had animals? And this is what we talk to the national organizations about. Are you asking about animals? Are you encouraging the domestic violence shelters to become pet inclusive? This is what the SAFeTY program is here for. This is what we do. And through the SAFeTY program, I am aware and have confirmed about 300 pet inclusive shelters in the United States. Now, there are still no pet inclusive shelters in the District of Columbia, Delaware, Hawaii, although I believe that there is one in progress because they received a federal grant,
There are no pet inclusive shelters in Nebraska or Rhode Island. So we have 5 states that still need a pet inclusive shelter. Okay, so getting back to, is your community pet inclusive? Here's what I recommend. When people contact me and say, hey, I want my local domestic violence shelter to become a SAFeTY shelter. I want to create a domestic violence shelter that is pet inclusive. Here's the thing. Number one, if you want to create a domestic violence shelter, if you are a kind-hearted citizen, you have the money, you have the time, you have the resources. Number one, I recommend talking with another domestic violence shelter or contacting the National Network to End Domestic Violence. There are regulations and laws involved in setting up a shelter, and you'll want to make sure that you are in compliance in doing so. Okay? Once a domestic violence shelter is established and licensed and ready to go, that is when the SAFeTY program can come in and help you make it pet inclusive. We only work with existing domestic violence shelters. We are not set up to help you create a domestic violence shelter. That's where you need to go to the domestic violence professionals and talk to them and find out how it's done. Okay? Number 2, what can you do? I want you to go to the SAFeTYprogram.org website, go to the shelter listing, and is your community listed? Do you have a pet inclusive domestic violence shelter? If not, do you know somebody who works at your community domestic violence shelter or domestic violence agency? Or do you know someone who knows someone? What I have learned over the years is that networking to find a connection is the best step. If you just cold call or send a cold email to a domestic violence shelter, you're likely not going to get a response. But if you know someone who knows somebody at the domestic violence shelter, that is your in. So I usually find that someone in a Kiwanis club, a Rotary club, a Zonta club, some community organization, they will know somebody at your local shelter. Do you know somebody in your local government? Chances are they know somebody that works at the local shelter. If you can work a connection like that, you can then likely get to a decision maker at the shelter. And that leads me to recommendation number 3. If the shelter is not pet inclusive, you can go directly to that person and ask them to request the SAFeTY Startup Manual. It is free to domestic violence shelters. They can go right to SAFeTYprogram.org and they can request it. They can also request a free call with me. And I will answer their questions. I will find out what their setup is like. I will help them craft the best plan. Because I find that a lot of shelters instinctively think that they cannot house pets on site. But once I talk to them, once I get an idea of their layout, I have always found a solution 100% of the time. I am a solution-driven thinker. So ask them to request the manual and then request a call with me, and I will work with them. We are free to domestic violence shelters. And then number 4, offer to help them in whatever capacity you are skilled in. Shelters need help writing grants. Are you good at writing grants? Are you good at posting on social media? Maybe you can take that off their plate. Are you good at networking and can bring in community partners? Can you go out and talk to community partners about helping the shelter? Can you help with transporting animals? There are shelter pets that are in the domestic violence shelter that maybe need to go to a veterinarian. Maybe they need to go off-site for a time. Can you help with that? Are you set up to house large animals or farm animals? Do you own farmland? Do you have a barn? Are you able to help foster them? Ask the local shelter, domestic violence shelter, if they will accept volunteers on site. Maybe you can help them with the animals. walk the dogs, clean the cages, that sort of thing. So there's a variety of things that you can do. And I love getting these messages where people want to help. So I hope this gives you some really good ideas. And if you have any questions, post a comment below and I will answer you. But the number one thing is to look at your community and find out if your community is pet inclusive for those experiencing domestic violence. Because if it's not, reach out to the SAFeTY program. This is what we do, and we are here to help. All right, take care and thanks for listening.